Hi, I'm Nikita and this is Isha, and we chose to do a presentation on racism and stereotypes.
So we chose this topic because we think that it's talked a lot about in the media, and however it's not talked about enough at school, and it's something that affects many people.
So we organized our presentation in terms of a few questions that we thought would be important to address. And the first one we have is, why does racism occur? Alright, so we have a few bullets here that explain why it occurs. And the first one we have here is the in-group out-group bias, which is a term we learned about in our AP psychology class. But in terms of racism, it refers to when people of the same race view their quote-unquote group as different from others, and they tend to amplify those differences. And it's basically a form of mental categorizations that humans naturally do to simplify their view of the world. And the second point we have here is stereotypes, which is another term that we learned about in class, but it refers to overgeneralized beliefs about a particular class of people. And I feel like a lot of us have encountered examples of these in our daily lives, and some of us may think that they're pretty harmless, but they can eventually lead to false misconceptions that influence really dangerous actions in certain people. And the third bullet we have here is lack of education, which doesn't necessarily apply to our school because we're exposed to so much diversity and we learn about it a lot in schools. But people in certain areas of the U.S. don't have the same curriculums that we have, and they aren't exposed to the same diversity as we are. And this can lead to the spread of a lot of false misconceptions, cultural unawareness, and an ignorance of certain customs and traditions. And then the fourth one we have here is defense mechanisms, which is a pretty small cause, but it's when people with these kind of beliefs tend to project their own insecurities and sense of inferiority onto other people. So the next bullet we have here is upbringing, which is the idea that children who are raised in environments where their parents have certain demeaning beliefs, this is the idea that those children may end up adopting those beliefs as their own, which can be really harmful. And then the last and probably the biggest reason for racism is unconscious and implicit bias, which is the fact that although the outright racism and blatant racism that we read about in textbooks and we sometimes hear about in the media is not as prevalent anymore and it's kind of on the decline, plenty of people still carry biases in the back of their mind, and those biases can eventually develop into hateful actions. So we wanted to show you guys what racism looks like in today's day and age, and a few claims have been made that racism doesn't exist anymore, but these show you guys that is clearly not the case. And what we have here are a few tweets that are in reference to the Miss America winner from a few years ago, who is named Miss Nina Davuluri, and she is an Indian American woman. And the first tweet we have here says, the only reason she won is because her people said they would lower gas prices. And the second one says, I'm currently so mad right now, a Arab won. And then the last one here says, more like Miss Terrorist, which is a pretty big example of the kind of ignorance that goes around on the internet and sometimes even in real life. And then we have here a screenshot of a Snapchat. And what they have done here is they circled a man in a Sikh turban, Sikh meaning the religion, and they captioned it, never mind, I might not make it to Indy. And next one.
So these bottom two are talking, so the first one says, a woman calls police on a black family for barbecuing at a lake in Oakland. And the second one, down here, says, Starbucks apologizes after staff calls police to arrest 2 black men who didn't order anything. So these are some examples of what Nikita was talking about earlier about implicit bias and not realizing that you might actually be doing something wrong because of your previous misconceptions.
Yeah, and going along with that, these people who called the police on those families, they may have not really realized what they were doing, as Isha said, but their actions were probably influenced by those misconceptions and stereotypes in their head and that implicit bias. Alright, so we have an image here of the KKK rally in Charlottesville, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about. And it's really sad to see that groups like this still exist nowadays, but they do. And then we have an image here. It's a group of girls who have face masks on, and they captioned it, Black Lives Matter. And they probably thought they were making a harmless joke, but in reality, this image is probably really insulting to a lot of different groups of people. So the next thing we thought would be important to cover is the impact of racism, especially on those victims of it. And the first thing that we found in our research is it has a really destructive effect on mental health, as it can cause emotional stress, lowered self-esteem, internalized hatred, and apologetic behavior in those who are victims of discrimination. And studies have also found increased rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a whole bunch of other disorders and disorder symptoms among those people who are affected. And these disorders can eventually lead to unhealthy coping behaviors. And the third term we have here is microaggression, which is a term that refers to really under the radar comments that communicate hostile feelings to those people who it's used against. And if someone experiences microaggressive behavior directed towards them on a daily basis in like the workplace or at school, this can eventually have a really cumulative destructive effect on their mental health, as we mentioned in the first bullet point. And the last point we have here is physical stress, which we learned about in AP Psychology as the gas syndrome. And studies have shown that there is increased blood pressure and higher heart rates among people who are victims of racism. And these impacts are all reasons why it's really important to discuss this issue and work towards fixing it.
So here we have a comparison of our school and Rockridge. So I just want to talk about, so this is the demographics for Rockridge. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of diversity. There's a pretty decent mix of all the races. And so a lot of other schools may not be like this. And so like, since we have so much diversity, it's really easy, there's not as much racism or discrimination because we all talk to each other and we are so exposed to it and so used to it that it doesn't really exist as much. However, there are other parts of America, like this high school in Massachusetts. And as you can see, these are the demographics for this high school. And as you can see, there's a lot of just one race and like hardly any of the others. And for a high school like this, there might be a lot more racism because they're not really exposed to the kind of diversity that we are. And this is another reason that it's so important to talk about it at schools so that people are not affected as much because it can, as Nikita talked about, cause depression and anxiety through these microaggressions that might occur at these schools. That might not occur at our school, and we're so fortunate to have this kind of diversity. So how can we combat racism? The first thing is to make diversity a priority. So the first bullet says encourage representation. So we want to encourage all kinds of people at schools and in the workplace and in the media so that people are more exposed to it at school, at work, and while watching TV and stuff, just through mere exposure effect, which is this bottom bullet here. And so in the psychology, we talked about what mere exposure effect was. And it is basically the increased liking of a new stimulus when you are exposed to it more and more. So in terms of racism and stereotyping, we can, as you are exposed to more and more diversity, you'll find out that there are actually not that many differences between you and the other person, and that there are a lot more similarities, and you'll start to like that person more. And so something that's also really important is to just recognize that there are different cultures and to also respect them as well. And just acknowledge that there are differences between us, but that shouldn't be the cause of any kind of discrimination, and we should just accept it and move forward. The next thing is education about different cultures. So like mere exposure effect, education about these different cultures and talking about it and explaining it to people will help them understand other cultures more, and which will in turn eliminate these misconceptions, and they will start to, and when you understand more about other cultures, you will become more accepting and understanding of them. And obviously we should incorporate lessons in the workplace and at school, and this is important because it'll help teach people about different cultures and expose them to what other people, like for example in the man who's wearing the turban, that man who posted that Snapchat maybe didn't realize what it meant, and so education about those kinds of things will help to eliminate those misconceptions. and of course to increase intercultural understanding, so just learning more about it as well. Another thing is to, of course, reduce our tendency to rely on stereotypes, prejudices, and in-group bias. So we learned about stereotyping earlier this year in psych, and it's just basically you have like a misconception about a large group of people, or you just, a misconception about a large group of people. And so what is important to do about this is to recognize and realize that our inconsistencies and fallacies with our beliefs, and to try and reduce them as much as possible by learning about them more, and just trying to reduce them as much as possible, and to raise awareness for anti-prejudice social norms, so like being more inclusive and things like that. And we should also help others, not just ourselves, to realize these things, because they may not have the kind of education that we do as well. And so another thing is to reduce in-group bias. And so what in-group bias is that you favor your own group, and you see your group as better than everyone else. And this applies to racism in that you may see your own race as better than or superior to other groups. And so a way to reduce this is to just become more inclusive, and to talk about, or just to talk with people of different races. And this goes back to encouraging diversity as well, because when you talk to and you just become more inclusive with other people, you understand them more as well. And of course, the last thing is to confront racism when it occurs. So this is obviously a more hard one to do, because it's more direct, but it's important to remember that there are strength in numbers, and it is harder to discriminate against a large group of people than just one person. And it's important to just stand up for any victims of racism, because once the person who is being racist sees that there are a lot of people supporting, they may also realize that what they are doing is wrong, and maybe not a joke like the girls in the picture earlier with the face masks. And also, if possible, to help people realize why their words are wrong, because they may not realize with, for example, with the implicit bias, they may not realize that they're being harmful. They may realize they're just making a joke. But when you help people realize what's right and wrong, they will become more respectful as well.
So that's all we have for you guys today, and we hope you learned a little bit about what this is and how you can work towards stopping it. And thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching.